Welcome to SPL Mixing. In this video, I will answer a viewer question and hopefully answer a question or two that you never asked but wanted to know the answer to anyway. I will show some technical approaches to help increase mix depth if that is your aim, as well as explain some ways to think about those techniques that I'll discuss. Depth in mixing is the illusion of distance from front to back. It's an illusion because there's no actual depth beyond the speakers. Depth is created as a consequence of applying processing to different elements in a mix to manipulate our perception, reverb being the most common processing used. Sometimes depth is a result of instrument choice, arrangement, and recording techniques used in production, but you can almost always increase that further in the mixdown process. If you've ever put reverb directly on an instrument, you know that it soon turns into a swampy mess and it blurs the sound. It doesn't necessarily feel like it's further away. Our brains are much tougher to fool than that, so we need to work a lot harder to foster that illusion to create a compelling 3D space. Let me break it down into some easier concepts. The fundamental ingredient here for creating depth is contrast. To create contrast, where you have no tangible reference point, you need to offset at least 2 points from one another to create that contrast. Here I have a very crude example of contrast. I've drawn two colored squares, one on top of the other, and as you can see, if I lower the opacity of either of them, one appears to move in front of the other. If the same opacity value is applied to both, then it's harder to see which of the two is in the foreground and which makes up the background, because they could be either in this case, making them essentially both the same. Therefore, if something is to be near, then something must be far to show that the other is closer to you. If something is dry, something needs to be reverberant. If something is bright, something else needs to be darker to make the other appear bright. We outline the boundaries of the space by focusing some elements and lessening others, contrasting focus with indistinctness. Let's start with volume. A close sound in real life is generally louder, therefore a distant sound is naturally quieter. Think of a distant storm versus a nearby clap of thunder with lightning. A 100% reverb applied directly to a track really only serves to blur the direct sound, so there's no real depth payoff from that. If, however, the reverb is blended with the direct sound, we start to see the instrument and its reverb as two distinct and contrasting parts. To blend the reverb, we apply it directly and dial the mix control down to around 30% or less. Or we set up an aux with 100% reverb and we send our track to it. The latter approach is more versatile because you can apply reverb to other mix elements by different amounts. We can then perhaps fill in the middle ground of the depth too. Some plugins also allow you to remove excess recorded reverb from the direct sound, so keep this in mind as an option if you decide you want to pull a blurred instrument more into focus. In real life, distant sounds lack higher frequencies the further away they are, so we can emulate that quite easily using EQ. The following suggested EQ filter settings are conservative starting points. There are no magic frequencies, so adjust according to taste. To pull an instrument forward, try boosting a shelf EQ at 4 kHz with a wide Q until the desired effect is reached. To push an instrument back, low pass with a gentle 6 dB slope at 4 kHz. Now, it makes no sense to add top end to an already bright instrument that you want to draw focus to. So you have to look at the overall context. Consider selectively low passing other tracks instead. As distance increases, we also lose low end information from as high as 200 Hz. A gentle 6 dB high pass in combination with the low pass filter can further help push an instrument into the background. To give more proximity, leave the lows flat and boost a wide bell at around 200 Hz. In subtler applications where two instruments are similar but compete for attention, assign precedence to one of them. Try first flipping the polarity on one of them to see if that helps, as you may find that common frequencies attenuate enough to negate any further EQ. If not, try boosting a bell shape on the instrument you wish to feature in the mid to upper mid presence regions. If there's too much presence, cut the same frequency from the opposing instrument instead. You can, of course, apply both the alternate track, boost and cut for maximum separation. Creating depth is as much about contrast through separation as it is about balance. So the two must work hand in hand. Respect the balance when making these EQ decisions. Combine what we know about volume, reverb, and EQ, and we really start to affect depth. Reverb also responds well to the same EQ moves discussed earlier, so try rolling off the top and bottom frequencies to help push it further back. Also, remove any competing mid-range frequencies that still focus from the direct sound to help increase that contrast. The reverb is almost always going to sit quieter than the dry sound, but you can obviously accentuate this relationship further by attenuating the reverb more. These same principles also apply to adding delay or echo. The delay already contrasts the original sound by arriving later, but you can always color it with EQ like we have the reverbs. It's also worth experimenting with the amount of pre-delay on a reverb. If your reverb doesn't have pre-delay, you can achieve the same ends by placing a transparent delay before the reverb. Its job is to delay the onset of the early reflections and tail from the reverb. Depending on the source, you can delay anything from 1 to 150 milliseconds or more. Reverbs usually detach from the direct sound beyond 38 milliseconds. This can sometimes make the room feel bigger, as the direct sound takes longer to interact with the room boundaries and return. More importantly, pre-delay can help separate the reverb and push it out of the way of the direct sound, adding more contrast. How can compression create depth? Compression is my obsession. It's the most interesting tool that we have for creating depth. Apply enough gain reduction to an instrument and you'll understand how different attack and release settings change tone. Set a fast attack and a release to squash the initial transient of an instrument, and the resulting tone is much darker, pushing it towards the background. Conversely, use a slow attack and release and the compressor misses the transient completely, instead acting upon the sustained portion of the sound that follows. Since the transient is the brightest part of the sound, the instrument shifts forward in the mix because the sustained portion is attenuated. Our ear is able to pick out the beginning of each note more easily, and so it grabs more of our attention. Transient designers can achieve similar results, although I find they're not always kind to the overall sound in the same way that compressors are. But they are nonetheless worth experimenting with. Compression, in simple terms, is about automatically writing down the levels when they get too loud based on the threshold. If you remember, I first mentioned contrast in volume for creating depth. So another way to create contrast is by having dynamic contrast between instruments. It means some instruments are dynamic and others are not. Listen to any EDM song that has a big kick and synth pads. The kick has the same consistent level, but the synths are much more inconsistent or dynamic, as they duck out of the way of the kick. This contrast in dynamic range between different parts is yet another way to leverage depth, because the front to back movement of one contrasts the lack of movement of the other. Now, imagine using all of these techniques with multi-band compression or dynamic EQ on both individual tracks and reverb, where you have control over frequency bands and their attack and release settings. Lastly, I often use distortion to bring important sounds forward in ways that EQ cannot, by blending in parallel or mixed directly on the track itself. The distortion is more dynamic in nature than regular EQ, so it does introduce a subtler form of dynamic contrast compared to compression. Engineers will sometimes refer to adding harmonic distortion as putting some hair on it. I see that as describing the effect of transient-esque frequencies jumping out like bubbles on the surface of simmering water, chaotically coming and going throughout the whole sound envelope. Harmonic distortion can create subtle contrast. Used heavily, it can really push something forward or back, depending on the type of distortion used and the tone that it produces. A painter can use a blank canvas and his or her paint to create the appearance of a 3D environment. But remember, it started as a flat canvas. The more the art, or the music in our case, aligns with our personal experiences, the greater the illusion. Which instruments are important? Which are less important? Once you figure out what instruments occupy the fore, middle, and background, creating depth using these techniques becomes second nature. So focus on listening intently to visualize the space that the instruments inhabit and where you want each instrument to sit, and the technical remedies will suggest themselves. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you have a question. Please also support me on Patreon. Happy mixing.